on that note, I am going to turn it over to our first speaker of the night. We have actually 3 speakers altogether. We have Ashley Kerrick here from Second Place East. We also have an impacted person. Lynette is going to come and talk to us a little bit about Lauren. I'm sorry, Lauren is going to tell us a little bit about her story. And then a little bit later, we're going to reach out to the Rochester Homeless Union, and they're going to talk to us a little bit about the work that they're doing. So for right now, we're going to turn it over to Ashley. Thank you very much for joining us, Ashley.
Before Ashley comes and speaks, we're having a little trouble with all the water. Please bear with us. Seems like everything's frozen. So it is what it is. And if you really got to go, there's a Dunkin' Donuts across the street. I'm sorry. Thank you.
Definitely a first for us.
Okay, so before I start, I just want to say I'm not a public speaker. I avoided public speaking classes all of my educational career, so this is not what I do on a day-to-day basis. So
It's over now.
So I apologize.
It's over.
So my name is Ashley Kerrick. I work with Charities, and I've kind of been all over the place. I had 5 years in the schools with emotionally disturbed and intellectually disabled students. I really fell into the mental health piece of that and really enjoyed that. And then I jumped from there to acute inpatient psychiatric. And then from there jumped into Catholic Charities. I've been there almost 6 years now. I've done several different things with the agency. I went from residential case management, providing people the skills they need to live independently in their homes, while providing rental subsidy from the agency, to street outreach, which I'm going to talk a lot about, and now I have been temporarily managing our homeless shelter since the spring of last year.
Can you hear in the back?
I have a big voice, I don't need to. So before I get into kind of the bulk of everything that I'm going to talk about, I wanted to share 3 really powerful statements that I've heard in my work, and I'm sure we've heard in the community. They're very bold statements. They're uneducated statements, and I just want you to kind of keep those statements in the back of your mind as I go through these scenarios, the people I've worked with, the situations that I've seen people encounter, and I just want to say I'm not speaking on behalf of homeless people in our community. I'm only speaking to what I see day to day through my work, and the experiences that they've opened up to me about. I in no way want to say that I'm up here speaking on behalf of anyone or that I have myself experienced homelessness. So these are the 3 statements I just want you to keep in mind as I share what I'm about to share. And at the end, after I've shared everything, kind of reflect back on those statements and what did you learn to be kind of the best answer to those questions. How could you respond when somebody says something like that? We don't have homeless people here in Elmira. There's no homeless people here. There just isn't. Why do they keep having children when they can't afford the ones that they have? I'm sure we've all heard that one. I am not going to enable that person when they could just go get a job and get off the streets on their own. Again, just keep those in mind, and as I go through these things, think about those really, really bold, uneducated statements. So I touched on street outreach. My role in that job is basically to make a relationship with those who are living on the streets. These are the people who don't want to access our homeless shelter. They don't want to work with people like me. They don't want to come through the door and ask for help. They are literally homeless. They're sleeping in abandoned buildings. They're sleeping in storage sheds. They're sleeping in people's sheds in their backyard, in a chicken coop on someone's property. They're out of sight, and they're not. These are people that are not couch surfing. They are truly, truly homeless. Obviously, the long-term goal of me working with these folks is to hopefully connect them to the services that they do desperately need. But it's on their timeline, and it's not me pressuring and asking people, oh, well, what about this service? This is really great. You should get in. I try not to even bring up a service because it's really more about building that relationship, and there's just so many factors that go into somebody obtaining stable housing. It's really overwhelming. It's really overwhelming for them to even be asked a question, well, why don't you go to DSS? Why don't you just go ask for help? Maybe they haven't showered in a week and they don't want to be looked at funny by everybody around them. There's so many things that go into obtaining stable housing that for people who aren't experiencing it can sit back and say, yeah, that's simple, go fix that, go do this, go do that. You don't get to see the barriers that these people face every single day when they're trying, even when they're trying. So again, there's just so many factors that go into it. In many lines of work, in what some of us do, we know the funding isn't there for the staffing that's needed for the people that we're serving. Unfortunately, that comes down to our conversations with people being very transactional. Okay, I'm going to do this and tell you to go do this, and you're going to bring it back to me tomorrow. So really my role, like I said, is to not have that transactional conversation. It's to have a human conversation and to break down those barriers and to allow someone to trust me. And then when they're ready to say, you know what, I know you know about that program, could you share some information with me about that? Or maybe they do bring up something and I say, hey, I know a program that serves situations like that. Would you like to get some more information about it? So they just lack trust for organizations in the procedures that we're all bound by. They lack that trust because the procedures of our day-to-day business don't fit into how they experience things and how they, might need a little bit of help filling out the paperwork, or they might need an explanation on what to do when they go to this building and then they're told to go to this building. They need more support than what we're able to offer organizationally. And again, that goes back to the funding and the number of people that we're serving in these small and even large agencies in our community. So the barriers to these individuals accessing the services that they may desire. They may want these services, but there just is a lot of barriers to accessing them. That's kind of I like that part of my job because I don't have to answer to anybody and say like, oh, what's John Smith doing today? Because I haven't seen a service plan review on him, and there is none of that. I like to not have to answer about it.
You have to hide your shame now.
So, but again, that lack of requirement has proven really successful. Not placing a burden or a requirement on somebody who's not ready really has proven really successful. I've sat under a bridge and shared day-old pastries from the food pantry with these folks and just listened and not said, oh, let me drive you to DSS and get you signed up for all the benefits. It's just that time with someone. My role really is to provide them with the things that they need so they can stay where they're at until they're ready to come from where they're at. And to truly just meet them where they're at, literally, under a bridge, under a overpass, closest to an abandoned building. So they know that I have the information that they need, and it's up to them to kind of ask me when they're ready. It really does start to naturally work its way into the conversations as you get to know somebody. You run out of things to talk about, and so it does naturally start to work its way into the conversation, whether I'm linking something that they said to a service that our community provides, or whether they're requesting information about the service. To give you some perspective into our local homelessness, I wanted to share two really different stories of individuals that I have worked with in a street outreach capacity. Example one is a gentleman that I worked with here in Elmira locally, and he was one of, if not the highest utilizers of Medicaid dollars in our county. He was a horrific type 1 diabetic young man, and he's living from abandoned building to abandoned building to, he maybe spent some time couch surfing, but he truly was homeless. Because of his homelessness, homeless people often experience their things being stolen. It's a constant battle of providing something, and the next day they're back, I lost everything. Because they're staying in shady places. They're staying with people that that they can't trust and that they don't know. So his medications would get stolen. He wouldn't be able to recertify his Medicaid to ensure that he had the needed medications that to manage his diabetes. he found himself in the hospital more than not, sometimes in the ICU and comas. To be perfectly honest, I got a call one day and they were looking for a next of kin because they didn't think he was going to make it. I am glad to say that after months of working with him in a street outreach capacity, I never in a million years thought he'd ever commit to housing, let alone housing with support. He did commit, and with the awesome help of some really awesome other providers in our community, we got him in. And he has, I wish I had the numbers, I tried really hard to get them today because I've used them before, but they're great. He had so many hospitalizations prior to admission, and since he's been admitted, he's had less than I can count on one hand. And I'm talking upwards of many, many dozens prior to his admissions. He ended up being a candidate for the pump. I don't know all that medical stuff, but ended up being a candidate for the pump, and he's been able to really get that under control. Is there other things he still needs to work on? Absolutely, but that I think really speaks for itself. Even if we're not involved in homelessness in some, we're all part to it, and that example is really, really powerful because here's this man who's spending so much money of the Medicaid dollars for our community, and it's really a socioeconomic problem. It's not the medical problem. It just isn't. It's the housing problem. The other example I want to share is while conducting our annual point in time, which is a count that the Housing and Urban Development requires us to count individuals on a certain night in January to identify how many homeless folks we have in our community. We ran into this gentleman sleeping in the annex of a building. He was not happy to see me at all. He used a lot of really colorful language to express that. He was really, really standoffish. I'm very persistent, so I kept delivering notes and little food packages, and finally we were able to have a conversation. And what I did learn about this man is that although he didn't want to talk to me, I found out that he was someone who worked his entire life. He didn't come from poverty. He came from a blue-collar family. He worked factories locally his entire life, and he was just shy of collecting Social Security without penalty, and he refused to take a penalty on that hard-earned money that he really, really earned. So, just over our brief encounters, that's the information that I gathered from him. And here's this man, and that night it was negative 17 degrees the night that I met him. And here he is sleeping in the annex of a building, and this man worked his whole life for that money. It's just amazing. So while these are just two stories of so many people that I've worked with in street outreach, they do shed light on how individual people's experiences can be. I could stand up here and tell you 200 stories, and they're all going to sound totally different. Especially here locally, in our community. Throughout the first year of running our street outreach program with Catholic Charities, we served approximately 25 individuals. That number doesn't sound like a lot when you're comparing it to other numbers of people that we served, but those 25 people were literally homeless, had nowhere to call home. They didn't even have a couch to stay on at a friend's or a family member's house. They were literally homeless. Out of the 25 people, we had a 58% success rate in getting them off the street. I'm not sharing that statistic to brag about the work that the agency does. That's not my point at all. My point in sharing that statistic is to show that when that little bit of hope is provided to someone and that little bit of help is provided to someone, look at that success rate. 58% of those 25 people got off the street and had a place to lay their head at nighttime. Again, it has nothing to do with our success. It's the success of those people and what they are capable of when they're provided what they need to be successful. It just proves that they want to change their situation. They just need the means to do so. And everybody's means are very different. They're not so structured how our agencies and our organizations are structured. I want to touch a little bit on homelessness in our community versus homelessness in other areas. People in our community who are experiencing homelessness aren't what we see on our national news at nighttime. They're not these homeless encampments out in the brush lot. Our homeless population is hidden. They don't want you knowing that they're there. they're going to do everything they can for you not to know that they're there. I've worked with people for 2 years who have looked me straight in my face and said, I'm not homeless, only to find out 2 years later that they are. They don't identify as homeless. They're not panhandling on the side of the road. They're not performing on a busy street to get a couple bucks. Our homeless population is very different even from the Tompkins County. Like Tompkins County, it's legal to busk and panhandle and do these things. We don't see that here. So just because we're not seeing them doesn't mean that they're not here. They are here. They are in abandoned buildings. They're in our shelter. They're parents who fell behind on rent. They are men or women who found themselves in an unsafe relationship and had to flee in the middle of the night with the clothes on their backs. There's so many situations that we don't think of when we just think of homelessness. And I think that's just really powerful. In the 2018 annual point in time count, which I kind of just explained, it's our count of homeless population in our area. Our continuum of care, which is just a fancy way of saying our surrounding counties that we work together to plan for homelessness with, which encompasses Allegheny, Steuben, Chemung, Livingston, and Schuyler counties, identified 233 individuals utilizing shelter beds, transitional housing beds, and being unsheltered. That's all together, gathered all together. Transitional housing beds are places like the domestic violence shelter, temporary shelters like that. So when people say that there is no homeless people, our data that gets submitted to the federal government really tells you otherwise. Switching gears to the shelter itself, Catholic Charities Second Placey's homeless shelter serves men, women, and children. I know that there's a lot of conversation in the community about what we serve, what we don't serve, our maximum capacity, so I kind of want to touch on that a little bit. We serve men, women, and children in one home with shared common areas. Men and women sleep separately. There's a men's side and a women's side. Again, it's not what you see on your nightly news. It's a home. It's got a living room and a kitchen, and the beds at most are 3 in a room. And they are their bedrooms. Their bedrooms in a home. It's actually a duplex. We house 15 people inside the house. And we utilize local motels for overflow, so there is no actual maximum capacity. Those being served in the shelter are literally homeless. They have nowhere else to go and no means to immediately identify other housing for themselves for whatever reason. And again, I already touched on all of the very different reasons. We receive referrals from local community agencies like Child Protective Services, Adult Protective Services, local police departments, and of course we have self-referrals every day. People who walk in and say, I'm homeless, I don't have anywhere to go. We accept individuals anytime, night or day, holidays, weekends. In the summer time when our shelter is not open 24 hours a day, it's open opposite of business hours. So you can access shelter through the Samaritan Center, or you can access shelter through the house, whatever time you're coming, depending. To put it into perspective a little bit, from January 1st, 2018 through now, we've served 477 individuals, men, women, and families, with an average number on any given day of 17. Remember I said our shelter holds 15. So we're serving to more than what our shelter was really even intended for initially, on average. On the first day of school from our city school district, September 4th, 2018, we were serving 21 adults and 19 children right here in Elmira. So don't tell me there's not homeless people here. That's 19 kids who got that first day of school packet and had to come home and put the shelter address on there for their address because they didn't have a home to go to. I want to touch on how misunderstood homelessness is. I think I have a little bit already, but I want to share some really powerful words. These are some of my favorite words I've ever heard in any work that I've done. And this comes from a client that I worked with years ago. She did really well for herself, and we asked her to share her story for something that we were working on. And while recording her, she said something that just like blew my mind wide open, and I have like loved these words ever since, and I've never reshared them since she shared them, but I thought this was a really good forum for it. And this is straight from her mouth. I paraphrased, but these are words that came out of her mouth. I just kept having babies by men who I thought loved me. When you grow up in a situation that's not healthy, where people are using drugs and living off the system, it's ingrained in you. Like, this is okay. I can live on welfare. I can have these babies and just get more money. I had to change my beliefs, my morals, and my values. I don't care how dysfunctional a family is, you still learned something good. So, feeding off of what she said, and kind of deciding on what I really wanted to touch on, and what, I think Becca mentioned it, that, it's not, homelessness is so much more, it's poverty, it's being poor, and poor doesn't mean you don't have money. Poor can be a various array of things that you're poor in. So I wanted to touch on poverty, and really break it down. There's generational poverty, which is defined as a family who has lived in poverty for at least 2 generations. And then there's situational or episodic poverty. This is a period of being poor due to a specific situation. It could be a loss of a job. It could be a major health event. It could be the loss of a spouse who was the major breadwinner in the house. Any huge financial burden that sets a family or a household back. These are so intertwined with each other. These small episodes of poverty can lead to generational poverty. They can lead to chronic homelessness. It's really important to identify those periods of poverty and fix them right then and there, because otherwise they do lead into the generational poverty. Some of the key factors in generational poverty are hopelessness. There's, we already said poverty doesn't mean you don't have money. There's parental poverty, educational poverty, spiritual poverty, and that's mimicking what they've already said. Without hope and the belief that someone's life can be better, those experiences are shared with the next generation, not even on purpose. They just don't have that motivation or the energy. They don't have, forget the motivation, they don't have the energy to create the change. The motivation and the energy are so low to create that change. They're in survival mode. They're not planning, they're surviving. Individuals experiencing generational poverty aren't planning for next week or next month. They're planning for today and maybe tomorrow. And this can be related, again, to health problems, financial problems, nutrition and education problems. Oftentimes, individuals experiencing generational poverty don't have a feeling of control. They don't feel like they are in control of what's happening tomorrow or the next week or next month. So why are they going to worry about it right now? They don't have any control out of it. They have a lack of control over the future, and what it might hold for them. Values, to make it very clear. Those who experience homelessness have values, and I think she really said it. No matter what you go through in life, there's something good. There's something there to hold on to, and they sometimes just differ. Sometimes the different light needs to be shed on them. Sometimes they need that hand to say, yes, I hear what you're saying. I know you're hurt from the events you've experienced, the trauma that, they talked about briefly. They just need someone who's going to listen, and somebody who is raised in generational poverty, their focus is on survival and short-term outcomes. They're not worried about those longer-term outcomes. As Becca and I talked about the importance of changing the narrative on homelessness in our community, these are just some of the things that came to mind. Being able to understand what landed somebody in their respective situation and what can we do to help. Not everybody has money to go pay a rent for somebody who's fallen behind on rent. That's not what I want anybody to take away from this. I'm not saying go give to your local organization, go do this. Small things you can do to help in our community: volunteer your time at local agencies who work really tirelessly to meet the needs of the people that I'm talking about. Volunteer at a local food pantry. The community kitchen here locally serves hundreds of meals a week to those in need in our community, thanks to nothing but volunteers, thanks to tons and tons of volunteers. Stay politically active, and I think Becca's doing a really good job at that from what I've gathered. Stay politically active, have your ears open and your feelers out for what's happening in our political climate. I talked about situational poverty. Look what's happening right now. There's so many families right now because of the shutdown, and I'm not going to get on a big political tangent, but who are experiencing situational poverty because they don't have a next paycheck. They don't know when they're getting a next paycheck, and maybe they didn't have a couple paychecks saved in the bank like we're all supposed to have. And so, again, just stay politically active. When there's cuts being made to housing programs or to benefits that homeless people need, let your voice be heard to who it needs to be heard to. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to ask, can you clarify whether or not it is a requirement for someone going to the shelter that they get a background check?
No, they do not have to.
Because I had to take someone and they were like, cannot come in until you get a background check. So it's like, okay, so I found out.
Yeah, so it used to be old practice, and trying to get it out of old practice has been really hard for some staff who have worked there a really long time, or even for local agencies, like they'll send somebody and they're like, oh, they told me to stop at the police station and get my warrant check. So, no.
Thank you.
Yep.
Do you find the majority of those that you build relationships with come from the Chemung County, Elmira area, or are they from outside? What's the percentage breakdown?
So I work specifically with just Chemung County, in street outreach, and also for the shelter, we work specifically with Chemung County. I would say, as far as the folks I've worked with who are literally on the street, not accessing the shelter, I think 2 out of anybody I've ever served are not in Elmira. They're in Elmira.
So in other words, these are Elmirans that
They're
are
in
running
Elmira.
into these situations.
Yes.
I think what he was asking is, where were they, are they originally from?
Right.
Are they
That's
native
the question.
Elmirans?
Oh,
That's
okay,
the
I'm sorry,
question.
misunderstood. Yes, yep.
The majority of them,
Yeah, majority.
at least 80%.
Yes. Yes. Yep. When you see somebody you may think is homeless, offer a meal, offer a coffee. If you don't have the monetary means to provide that, well, give them an ear. just let them talk. See what it is maybe that they just want to get off their chest. If you're not comfortable doing so, share their location and description with me so I can track them down. I have people who call me and say, I just saw this guy, he's wearing this, he looks, I'm not sure if he's homeless, I'm not comfortable asking. I have no shame, so. and I'll do my best to track them down and try to identify whether, they are in fact homeless or not. Most importantly, when you hear somebody talking negatively or uneducated about homelessness, educate. Tell them that is not true. Let me tell you a story, or let me share this, this thing I know with you. That's not what our data shows. Anything to educate somebody who is using these really powerful statements that are wrong, because there's people who hear those statements and that is true, that is fact. Just like if it's on Facebook, it must be real. Like that's how it happens.
Abraham Lincoln told me to watch my password on Facebook. So.
Yes. I've sat down with numerous people in our community who've just called and said, I have my own perception on homelessness and I want to meet and talk with you and try to work on my own perception. I'm open to that. And again, I think, just sharing the correct narrative with somebody who may have a skewed narrative. It's really all about educating yourself and those around you. It has nothing to do with monetary donations or even your time donated to an agency specifically. And being here right now is a really, really good start. So like I kind of said in the beginning, I have never experienced homelessness. I don't ever want to speak for those who have important stories to share. I can only share the experiences that they've opened up and shared with me.